A rich boy saw a hungry child searching through trash. His father's next move left everyone in tears. The boy was staring out the window when he saw it. Daniel pressed his nose against the cold glass of the black car and watched. He was 8 years old, sitting in the back seat of his father's Mercedes, parked outside a restaurant called Harlow's on the corner of 5th and Grove. The engine was still running. The air inside the car smelled like leather, and the faint trace of his father's cologne. A jazz song played low from the front speakers, the kind of music Daniel didn't understand but had grown up hearing. His father, Richard Calloway, had stepped inside the restaurant to confirm their reservation. He had told Daniel to wait. Daniel was good at waiting. He had a tablet, a half-eaten pack of crackers, and the kind of patience that only children raised in very comfortable households tend to develop. The patience of someone who has never needed to rush for anything. So he waited. And that was when he saw the other boy. At first, Daniel thought the boy was looking for something he had dropped. That was the only explanation his 8-year-old brain reached for. Maybe a ball, maybe a toy, maybe a coin he had seen roll into the gap beside the metal bin that stood outside the restaurant's side door. Daniel had lost a coin that way once, outside a bookshop, and he had spent a full 5 minutes trying to fish it out with a stick. But the other boy wasn't fishing for a lost coin. He was digging. Not quickly, not frantically. He moved with a kind of careful, practiced calm that Daniel couldn't name but could somehow feel, even through the glass, even from a distance of 30 feet. The boy was small, smaller than Daniel, though they looked to be roughly the same age. He was wearing a gray shirt that was too big for him, and his feet were bare against the pavement. The afternoon sun was still strong. The pavement was hot. Daniel could tell it was hot because he had stepped out of the car earlier to stretch his legs, and the heat had come up through the soles of his trainers immediately. The other boy had no trainers. Daniel watched him pull something from the bin, a paper bag folded closed. The boy opened it, looked inside, and his whole body changed. His shoulders dropped, not in disappointment, in relief. He pulled out something wrapped in foil, turned slightly away from the street, and began to eat. Daniel didn't look away. He didn't look away because something about the scene was pulling at a place inside him that he didn't have words for yet. He was 8. The vocabulary for what he was feeling hadn't grown in yet, the way certain teeth take time, but he felt it, a pulling, a wrongness, a question that his brain kept forming without knowing how to finish. Why is that boy eating from the bin? The answer didn't come, because the answer required a map of the world that Daniel simply didn't have. He had been raised in a house with 4 bedrooms and a garden. He went to a school where every child had a packed lunch and a snack, and sometimes 2 snacks. Hunger for Daniel meant the 20 minutes before dinner when his stomach growled and his mother told him to wait. That was what hunger was, a small discomfort, a short wait. The boy outside was not experiencing a short wait. Daniel pressed his palm flat against the glass. His breath fogged a small circle on the window. He watched the other boy eat standing up, turned slightly away, careful, as though he was afraid someone might take the food before he could finish it. And maybe he was. Maybe that fear was entirely reasonable. Daniel had no way to know. He was still watching when the car door opened. His father climbed into the back seat, bringing cold air and the faint smell of the restaurant's kitchen with him. Richard Calloway was a tall man, broad across the shoulders, with graying hair at his temples and hands that were always warm. He was wearing a dark blue shirt. He looked at Daniel first, the way he always did, a quick check, a habit he had never explained and Daniel had never questioned. Then he followed his son's gaze through the window. Richard went still. Not the stillness of surprise, not the stillness of someone who had seen something unexpected. It was a different kind of stillness, heavier and older than the moment. His jaw set. His hand, which had been reaching to close the car door, stopped moving. Daniel looked at his father. Dad. Richard said nothing. "Dad, that boy is eating from the rubbish bin." The word rubbish came out the way children say true things, plainly, without drama, because children haven't yet learned to soften the truth before offering it to adults. Richard Calloway looked at the boy outside for a long moment. Then he looked at Daniel. Then he did something Daniel had not expected. He handed Daniel his phone and his jacket. "Hold these," he said. He climbed back out of the car. Daniel turned in his seat and watched through the rear window as his father crossed the street. He didn't run. He didn't call out. He simply walked with the same unhurried steadiness he brought to everything, across the pavement toward the metal bin where the other boy was standing. The other boy heard him coming and turned. His whole body tensed. He took a small step back, clutching the foil wrapper to his chest. Richard stopped several feet away. He crouched down, bringing himself to the boy's level. He spoke. Daniel couldn't hear what was said through the glass and the low jazz and the traffic. He could only watch his father's face, calm, open, and the other boy's face, which was difficult to read from this distance, partly because the boy kept his chin low. The driver, a quiet man named Paul who had worked for Richard for 6 years, watched in the rearview mirror. His hand stayed on the wheel. He said nothing. He had learned long ago that Richard Calloway did not narrate his intentions ahead of time. Daniel didn't move. He sat with his father's jacket across his lap, and his father's phone face down on the seat beside him, and he watched. The other boy shook his head once. Then twice. Then he nodded. Richard stood back up, said something more, and then turned and walked back toward the car. His face was the same as it always was, composed, not performing anything. He opened the back door and looked at Daniel, and what he said was not what Daniel had expected. "Come on," he said, "we're going in." "All of us?" Daniel asked. Richard looked at him steadily. "All of us." Daniel climbed out of the car. His feet hit the warm pavement and he squinted in the afternoon light. His father was already walking back toward the side of the building, and this time, when he reached the other boy, he waited. Stood beside him, not behind him the way adults stand when they are hurting a child, beside him. The other boy looked at Daniel. Daniel looked back. Neither of them said anything. They were both 8 years old, standing on a pavement outside a restaurant, and the afternoon was very bright and very warm, and neither of them had any idea what was about to happen. Richard Calloway held the door open. They went inside. Daniel carried his father's jacket still. He didn't know why. He held it against his chest the whole way in, the way the other boy had held his foil wrapper, and he didn't notice he was doing it. The restaurant was cool and dim inside. The hostess looked up from her stand, and her eyes moved from Richard to Daniel to the other boy, and then back to Richard. Her expression shifted by barely a fraction. Richard met her gaze and said, pleasantly, "Table for 3. She smiled, "Of course, Mr. Calloway." And she led them to a corner booth. Daniel slid into the seat across from the other boy and looked at his hands. They were small and brown and very clean. Not clean in the way that meant he had just washed them. Clean in the way of someone who had been outside all day and whose skin was simply dry. Daniel noticed this without knowing why he was noticing it. His father sat beside him and picked up the menu. Daniel picked up his menu. The other boy picked up his menu and held it very carefully, the way a person holds something that might be taken away. Daniel stared at the words on the menu, the names of things he had eaten dozens of times at this restaurant and others, and for the first time in his life, the words seemed strange to him. Just words, on a card, meaning nothing unless you already knew the world they came from. He looked up at the other boy, who was staring at the menu with his lips pressed together and his eyes moving slowly over the page. Daniel said the only thing he could think of to say, "What's your name?" The other boy looked up. He had very dark eyes, steady and careful. He looked at Daniel the way people look at someone they are still deciding about. "Elias," he said. His voice was quieter than Daniel had expected, not shy. Just quiet, the way someone is quiet when they have learned that drawing attention is not always safe. "I'm Daniel," Daniel said. Elias nodded. Richard Calloway lowered his menu slightly and looked at both boys. "Elias," he said, "order whatever you like." Elias looked down at the menu. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he pointed to a picture near the bottom of the page. The waiter arrived and Elias pointed to the picture without speaking. The waiter noted it without flinching, without making a face, without doing anything other than smiling and writing it down. Richard ordered water. Daniel stared at that for a moment, his father, who always ordered the grilled chicken, ordering only water. He didn't ask about it. He ordered his usual pasta. And then they sat, the three of them, in the cool corner booth of Harlow's restaurant, while the city moved outside the window, and Daniel began, without knowing it, the slow and permanent process of learning something that no classroom had ever tried to teach him. The food came. Elias ate carefully. Not the way a starving person eats in movies, not desperately, not messily, not with tears. He ate carefully, methodically. The way someone eats when they have learned to make something last, to taste each part, to be present with it, because there is no guarantee of what comes next. Daniel watched him for a moment and then looked away, because watching felt wrong. It felt like looking at something private. Halfway through his pasta, without thinking, without deciding, Daniel slid half his plate across the table toward Elias. He didn't say anything. He just pushed it across and looked at his fork. Elias looked at the plate. He looked at Daniel. Daniel didn't look up. Elias pulled the plate toward him. Richard Calloway watched his son from the corner of his eye. He said nothing. He drank his water. Outside, a bus rolled past, and a woman walked by with a stroller, and the city continued its perfectly ordinary afternoon, entirely unaware that something real was happening in the corner booth of a restaurant on 5th and Grove. Something that could not be taken back. Something that had already, in ways none of them could fully see yet, begun. The drive back to Elias' shelter took 11 minutes. Daniel counted, because counting was the only thing he could think to do with his hands. They sat in the back of the car, all three of them, Daniel in the middle, and nobody spoke for the first several minutes, and the city outside the windows moved past in long, slow frames of light and buildings and people living their afternoon lives. Richard had asked Elias quietly in the restaurant where he was staying. Elias had answered with the name of a place on Clement Street. He said it the way you say the name of a place when you are not sure whether saying it will cause a problem, quickly, watching the listener's face. Richard's face had not changed. He had simply said, "All right," and asked for the bill. Daniel had noticed that Elias finished every single thing on both plates before they left. He had not drawn attention to it. He had looked at the window, at the other tables, at the pattern on the tablecloth, and he had let Elias eat in peace. Something told him, some instinct he hadn't known he possessed, that looking away was the right thing to do. Now they were in the car, the three of them, and Clement Street was 11 minutes away, and the silence between them was not an uncomfortable one. It was the silence of three people processing the same afternoon from three completely different positions. Paul drove without speaking. He had done this for 6 years, and he understood that silence in this car was sometimes the most important thing happening. Elias sat very straight. His hands were in his lap. He watched the city through the window with the focused attention of someone who pays attention to geography out of necessity, learning routes, noting landmarks, keeping track of where he was and how far from where he needed to be. These were habits. Daniel would not understand this for several more years, but he sensed, in the way children sense things they cannot explain, that the boy beside him was always, on some level, navigating. Daniel was thinking about the shoes. He couldn't stop thinking about them. The bare feet on the hot pavement, the specific image of it. He had felt the heat through his own trainers when he'd stepped out of the car earlier, and the thought of walking on that surface without anything between your skin and the ground was so physical, so present, that it sat in his chest like something he had swallowed wrong. He looked at Ilya's feet now in the car, still bare, still. He thought about his own trainers, white with a blue stripe, bought 3 weeks ago in a shop on the high street, while his mother held his school bag, and the shop assistant measured his foot with a cold metal tool and talked about arch support. He thought about how he had complained mildly that the lace holes were slightly stiff. He thought about this with a feeling he could not yet name. It was shame, not the hot panicked kind, the quiet kind. The kind that does not announce itself, but simply settles in. "Do you go to school?" Daniel asked. Elias turned from the window. "Sometimes," he said. Daniel didn't know what that meant. He wanted to ask, but something stopped him, the same instinct that had made him look away in the restaurant. Some awareness that his questions were loaded with assumptions, that every word he reached for came from a world Elias did not share, and that asking the wrong thing would be worse than saying nothing. So he just nodded, as though sometimes was a complete and entirely satisfying answer. Elias looked at him for a moment, then he looked back out the window. "Where do you go?" Elias asked, not challenging. Just returning the question, the way children do when they are trying to understand each other. "Fairfield Academy," Daniel said. Then, because he was suddenly aware of how the name sounded, he added nothing else. He didn't qualify it. He didn't apologize for it. He just let it sit. Elias nodded slowly. He had heard of Fairfield. Everyone had. It was the school with the iron gates on Whitmore Road and the green playing fields you could see from the bus. He had seen those fields from the bus many times. He had never once imagined being inside them. "Is it good?" Elias asked. "Yeah," Daniel said. "It's all right." A pause. "Do you have a favorite subject?" Elias asked. Daniel blinked. He hadn't expected that question. Something about it, the normalcy of it, the way it cut across everything and just asked an ordinary human thing, made his throat feel strange. "Maths," Daniel said. "You?" Elias considered. "Reading," he said, "when I can." When I can. Daniel held those 3 words in his head. He did not say anything about them. Richard Calloway had been listening to all of this from the corner of his attention while watching the street. Now he turned slightly and looked at Elias. "Are you comfortable where you're staying?" he asked. Elias glanced at him. "Yes," he said. It was the automatic answer, the safe answer. Richard looked at him for one moment longer than the question required, not pressing, just present. "All right," he said. The car turned onto Clement Street. It was a different kind of street, narrower. The buildings were older here, their faces worn, their windows showing curtains that had faded in the sun. There was a laundromat, a small shop with handwritten signs in the window, a church whose notice board had letters missing from its message. People sat on steps. A woman was hanging something over a balcony railing. A group of children were playing on the pavement with a flat ball, using the curb as a goal. Elias watched all of this as they drove slowly down the street, and his body changed as they got closer to wherever they were going. He sat slightly forward. He became more alert. This was his world, and he knew every signal in it. "Here," he said quietly, "you can stop here." Paul pulled the car to the curb. Elias reached for the door handle and then stopped. He turned to Richard Calloway, and what happened next was not something Daniel had expected. Elias, who had said very little, who had given very little away, who had carried himself through the entire afternoon with the composed caution of someone much older than 8, looked at Richard with something unguarded in his face. "Thank you," he said, and his voice was different. Not quieter, just real. The performance of self-sufficiency had come down by a fraction, and what was underneath it was a child who was very tired and who was genuinely grateful. Richard looked at him steadily, Take care of yourself, Elias. Elias nodded. He looked at Daniel once more. Daniel raised his hand, a small, awkward wave, the kind you give when you don't know if you're going to see someone again. Elias raised his hand back. Then he opened the door and stepped out onto the pavement, and he crossed to the building without looking back, the way people cross to places they don't want to be seen entering. The car door closed. Paul pulled back into traffic. Daniel sat in the space where Elias had been and felt the warmth still in the seat, and said nothing for a very long time. It was his father who spoke first. Daniel. Daniel looked up. Richard was watching him, not the way adults watch children when they are about to deliver a lesson, the way a person watches another person when they are deciding whether to tell them the truth. Yes, Daniel said. A pause, long enough that the car moved through an entire block before his father spoke again. I used to be him. The words landed in the car like something physical. Daniel felt them arrive before he understood them. He looked at his father's face, the gray temples, the warm hands, the dark blue shirt, the absolute calm, and tried to fit those 4 words to the man in front of him. What do you mean? He said. Richard turned back to the window. His jaw shifted slightly. When I was young, he said, I didn't have much. For a time, I didn't have enough. Daniel sat with this. He looked at his father's profile and then at the city moving past and then at his own hands, which were still holding, absently, the folded edge of his father's jacket. Were you on the street? He asked. The question came out small and careful. Sometimes, Richard said, the same word Elias had used about school, sometimes. Daniel absorbed this. He thought about the house with 4 bedrooms and the garden with the oak tree. He thought about his mother in the kitchen on Sunday mornings. He thought about Fairfield Academy and the iron gates and the green fields. He thought about how his father moved through the world steady, assured, as though the ground beneath him was reliable, and he tried to find the other man in that, the young man who had sometimes not had enough. He couldn't fully see it, but he believed it. He believed it because his father did not lie, and because of the way he had crouched, without any hesitation, to speak to Elias at eye level. That crouch. Daniel kept coming back to that. A man who had never been low would not know, instinctively, to go down to meet someone. But his father had known. He had crossed the street and gone down without thinking, because his body remembered what it meant to be looked down at. Richard said nothing more. Daniel didn't ask anything more. The city moved past. The jazz came softly from the front speakers. Paul drove without speaking, and Richard, without looking at his son, put his hand on Daniel's shoulder. He didn't squeeze. He didn't turn it into a speech. He just rested it there, warm and steady, and left it for the rest of the drive. When they got home, Daniel's mother, Caroline, met them at the door. She was a kind woman with light brown hair and a habit of reading the room quickly. She looked at Richard. She looked at Daniel. She saw something in both their faces, a shared weight, a shared quiet, and she didn't ask about it. She simply said, "Dinner in half an hour," and stepped aside. Daniel went to his room. He sat on the edge of his bed for a while without turning the light on. The room was dim and warm, and outside the window the garden was turning gold in the late afternoon, and the oak tree was casting a long shadow across the grass. He thought about Elias reading, "When I can." He thought about the careful way Elias had held the menu, as though it might be taken back. He thought about bare feet on hot pavement. He thought about his father's hand on his shoulder, heavy, still, saying nothing and meaning everything. He got up. He went to his wardrobe. He opened it and looked at the shelves of folded clothes, the hanging row of school shirts, the shoes lined up along the bottom. 6 pairs. He counted them without meaning to. 6 pairs of shoes. He stood there looking at them for a long time. Then he went downstairs for dinner. He sat in his usual chair and ate his usual meal and answered his mother's usual questions about his afternoon. He said they had gone to Harlow's. He said it was good. He said he'd met someone named Elias. His mother said, "Oh, a friend of yours." Daniel considered the question seriously, the way he always considered serious things. "I think so," he said, "maybe." Richard looked at him from across the table, and something passed between them, not a look exactly, more like a recognition. The beginning of a language they were only starting to build. Caroline looked between them both and decided, wisely, not to ask. She passed the bread and changed the subject, and the dinner continued, and the evening came, and the house grew quiet, and in his room on the second floor Daniel lay in the dark and could not sleep for a very long time. He was not sad. He was not happy. He was something else, something he didn't have a name for yet, something that sat in the center of his chest and hummed like a low current. He pressed his hand flat against his sternum, the way he had pressed his hand flat against the car window earlier, and he lay there with it, and he let it stay. Outside, somewhere across the city on Clement Street, Elias was doing whatever he did when the day was done. Daniel didn't know what that looked like. But he thought about it. He thought about it for a long time. And in the morning, everything was exactly the same as it had always been. And nothing was. The school week came back, as school weeks always do, with its noise and its routines and its small dramas that feel enormous when you are 8 years old. Daniel went to Fairfield on Monday with his packed lunch and his clean uniform, and sat in his usual seat beside his usual friend, a boy named Oliver who lived 3 streets away, and whose hair was always slightly too long, and who could talk about football for a length of time that seemed, to Daniel, almost physically impossible. Oliver talked about football. Daniel nodded and ate his biscuit and thought about Elias. He had not mentioned Elias to Oliver. He had turned the idea of it over several times, opened his mouth once at lunch and then let the moment pass. He could not explain why. It was not that he was ashamed of it. It was more that the afternoon on Fifth and Grove felt like something that lived in a separate room, with a different kind of light, and he was not ready to let it out yet. He didn't want anyone to handle it carelessly. So he kept it. He carried it the way you carry something fragile in both hands. His father had been different since that afternoon, not in a way that was visible to most people. Richard Calloway had gone back to work on Monday morning, into the office at 7:30, and had come home at 6:15, and had eaten dinner and read his reports and done all the things he always did. But there was something underneath the ordinary routine that Daniel could feel, the way you feel a change in the weather before the sky shows it. A new alertness, a new purposefulness. He caught his father on Tuesday evening on the phone in the study. Richard's voice was low, the way it got when the conversation was real rather than professional. Daniel paused outside the door. He wasn't trying to listen. He just stopped. He heard his father say, "There's a place on Clement Street. I want to know who runs it, and I want to know what they need." Then a pause. "No, not publicly. Quietly, I'm not interested in the credit." Daniel walked away from the door. He went back to his room and sat at his desk and opened his homework. He stared at the page for a moment without seeing it. "Not publicly, quietly, I'm not interested in the credit." He wrote those words in the margin of his notebook in small letters, and then he drew a box around them. He didn't know why. He just wanted them somewhere he could find them again. At school that week, his teacher, a patient woman named Mrs. Garland, handed out a worksheet about community and asked the class to write 3 sentences about what the word meant to them. Daniel stared at the blank lines. Around him, his classmates wrote quickly 3 sentences about their neighborhoods, their football clubs, their family. Oliver wrote about his local team supporters and drew a small badge next to the 3rd sentence. Daniel wrote, "Community means seeing someone who needs something and not walking past. It means going toward them, not away. I think most people want to help. They just forget that they can." Mrs. Garland read it at her desk while the class moved on to reading. She read it twice. Then she looked at Daniel, who was not paying attention to anything in particular, just staring at the middle distance with a small, private expression on his face, and she thought that something had happened to this boy recently. Something had shifted behind his eyes, but she couldn't say what it was, and she didn't ask. She gave him a small star at the top of the page. Daniel folded the page and put it in his bag. He would bring it home and put it in the drawer of his desk, and it would stay there for years, that folded page with the small star and the 3 sentences about community, growing soft at the creases, holding its shape. Thursday afternoon. Daniel was in the garden, sitting on the low branch of the oak tree that was just wide enough and low enough to be perfect for sitting, when his father came home early. He heard the car on the drive and the front door and his mother's voice in the hallway, and then footsteps across the kitchen and the back door opening. Richard came out into the garden in his shirt sleeves. He had loosened his tie. He looked at Daniel on the branch and said, "How long have you been up there?" "Since school," Daniel said. Richard came and stood under the tree. He looked up at Daniel with his hands in his pockets. "Come down for a minute." Daniel climbed down. He dropped to the grass and looked up at his father. Richard was holding something, an envelope sealed and plain. He held it out. "I need you to come with me somewhere on Saturday," he said. "There's something I want to show you." Daniel took the envelope and turned it over. No name on the front, no address, just paper sealed. "What's in here?" Daniel asked. "Not your business yet," Richard said, not unkindly. "Saturday." Daniel looked at him. "Is Elias going to be there?" His father looked at him steadily. "Yes." Daniel handed the envelope back. He didn't need to hold it. Knowing was enough. "All right," he said. "Saturday." Richard took the envelope and went back inside. Daniel climbed back up into the tree. He sat in the wide fork of the branch with his back against the trunk and looked out over the garden wall at the street beyond, where ordinary life was moving past at its ordinary pace, and he felt the low hum in his chest again, the thing without a name that had been with him since that afternoon outside Harlow's, and this time it was different. This time it had a direction. It was pointing forward. Saturday came. They picked Elias up from Clement Street at 9 in the morning. Richard had called ahead, Daniel didn't know how, didn't ask, and Elias was standing on the pavement outside the building when the car arrived. He was wearing the same gray shirt and different trousers. He was still barefoot. He got into the car. He looked at Daniel. Daniel looked at him. "Hello," Daniel said. "Hello," said Elias. They did not feel like strangers. They had skipped that somehow in the restaurant, in the silent car ride, in the small exchange of names and favorite subjects. They were not friends yet, not fully, not in the way that takes time and shared experience, but they were something. An understanding. A beginning. Richard drove them to a shop on the edge of town. Not a large shop. A children's shoe shop with a blue awning and a display of trainers in the window, and a bell above the door that rang when they pushed it open. Elias stopped just inside the door. He stood very still. Richard said quietly to the young woman behind the counter, "We need to find something that fits him well." He nodded toward Elias. She came out from behind the counter with a measuring board and knelt on the floor, the way shoe shop workers do, and asked Elias to put his foot on the board. He did it carefully. She measured. She noted the size. She stood and went to the shelves. Daniel watched Elias watch the shelves. He watched his face, careful, controlled, that extraordinary composure, and then he watched something move through it. Not emotion in the dramatic sense. Just the small, specific, very human experience of being treated like someone who matters, of having your foot measured, of having someone go and find the right size. Elias tried on 3 pairs. He stood up in each one, walked a few steps, looked down. He did this without excitement, without performance, with the same methodical care he brought to everything. But Daniel noticed that the second time he stood in the 3rd pair, the navy ones with the white sole, he pressed his feet down against the floor in a way that was different from how he walked. He pressed them down slowly, testing the cushion beneath him, feeling what it was like. He chose those ones. At the till, Richard paid. Elias watched the transaction. He said nothing. When they walked back to the car, Elias looked at his feet with each step, the way you do when something new is on you and you are still registering the fact of it. Daniel walked beside him. They were quiet for a moment, and then Elias said, not looking up, "He didn't have to do that." Daniel thought about this. "No," he said, "he didn't." Elias was quiet. "That's kind of the point," Daniel added. Elias looked at him. Something in his face shifted just slightly, just a fraction, and for the first time since Daniel had seen him outside the restaurant, Elias looked his age. He looked like a child who was 8 years old, wearing new shoes in the morning sun, and for one unguarded moment he almost smiled. Almost. Then the composure came back, quiet and quick. He looked ahead. He kept walking. But Daniel had seen it. And that fraction, that almost smile, that 1 second of being entirely a child, stayed with Daniel longer than anything else from that morning. It stayed with him the whole drive back to Clement Street and through the afternoon, and into the evening and long past the time he should have been asleep. Because it had cost Elias something to show it. And he had shown it anyway. That was not a small thing. 2 weeks passed, then 3. Then the summer holidays arrived and spread themselves across the city like warm light, and Daniel's days became loose and long, filled with garden cricket and reading and trips to the pool and the particular slow pleasure of having nowhere urgent to be. But Elias was still in the corner of everything, not loudly, just present the way certain thoughts are there when you reach for them and sometimes there when you don't. Daniel had not seen him again since the shoe shop Saturday. But he knew, because his father had told him, plainly and without fuss, that things were being arranged, that the man who ran the shelter on Clement Street had received some help, that Elias had been registered at a new school for September, that there were people involved now, quiet people, working the kinds of levers that most people don't know exist. Richard said none of this as though it was impressive. He said it the way he said things about the garden or the evening news, as information, shared as a matter of fact. Daniel listened the way you listen to things that are still too large to fully hold, but that you want to be ready for. It was his mother, Caroline, who changed the texture of those weeks. She was not a dramatic woman. She did not make speeches. But she had an instinct for action, a practical kindness that moved in straight lines, and once she had understood what Richard was doing and why, she moved quietly beside him with the ease of someone who had been waiting for exactly this. She organized a bag, not a charity bag, a specific bag. She went around the house with Daniel and asked him to choose things, not his oldest things, not the things he no longer wanted, but real things. Good things, clothes that fit, books he had loved, a football he used. Daniel pulled things from his shelves and his wardrobe with a seriousness his mother had not expected, and when the bag was full he said, "Is that enough?" And she said, "It's a very good start." They delivered it to the shelter on a Tuesday morning. Caroline spoke with the woman at the front desk. Daniel stood beside her and watched people moving through the corridors, adults mostly, but 1 or 2 children, and he felt the particular specific reality of places like this land in his chest in a way it hadn't from a distance. This was not the back of a car. This was not a restaurant window. This was inside. This was where Elias came back to each night. He thought about Elias doing his homework here, finding somewhere quiet, reading when I can. He thought about reading the way most people think about breathing, something available, something automatic, something you do because the room around you makes it possible. He had never, until this moment, considered that reading required a room. That reading required certain things to already be in place. He carried that thought home. That afternoon he went to his bookshelf and pulled out the 10 books he had loved most in the last 2 years. He stacked them on his desk. He looked at them for a while. Then he added 3 more. He carried them downstairs. His mother looked up from the table. "For Elias," he said. She didn't make a fuss of it. She didn't tell him it was wonderful or that she was proud of him. She just nodded and said, "We'll get those to him." Good, that was exactly the right thing to say. He went back upstairs. It was in this way, in these small, concrete, repeated acts, that Daniel began to understand something that the afternoon outside Harlow's had only suggested. He began to understand that the distance between his life and Elias was not a mystery. It was not fate. It was not the result of some invisible and unstoppable force. It was the accumulation of small things, small decisions, small arrangements, small moments of seeing or not seeing. And if it had been built by small things, it could be altered by small things. This was not a philosophy he could have put into words at 8 years old. But it was in him, being formed, the way certain things are formed, quietly, slowly, without announcement. September arrived. School started. And on the first day of the new term, a boy in a navy uniform with a white stripe walked through the gates of Clement Road Primary, the school 3 streets from the shelter, carrying a backpack that had a book in it. Not a school book. A book from Daniel's shelf. The one about the boy who finds a world behind a door, who discovers that the world is wide and strange, and more various than anything he had been told to expect. Elias sat in a new classroom. He put his bag under his chair. He looked at the board. He looked at the teacher. He looked at the other children. Then he opened his book under the desk, just for a moment, just to feel it there, and he put his hand on the page and he breathed. New shoes, a book, a classroom. Small things. The distance between one life and another, measured not in miles but in exactly this, in the willingness of someone to cross a street, to crouch down, to say, "You exist, I see you here." Years have a way of moving faster once you stop being surprised by them. Daniel turned 9, then 10, then 11, and the oak tree in the garden grew and the school years changed, and Oliver still talked about football with the same bottomless enthusiasm, and Mrs. Garland gave Daniel a star on a different piece of paper about a different subject, and none of that stopped. Life continued, as life does, in all its ordinary motions. And running underneath it, like a current beneath still water, was everything that had changed. Richard Calloway did not speak about what he was doing. He did not write an article about it or attend a gala or have his photograph taken. He met, twice a year, with the director of the Clement Street shelter, a woman named Patricia who had been running it for 11 years with limited funding and extraordinary patience, and he transferred money into an account that bore no name connected to his. He made phone calls. He sat on a committee, briefly, and then stepped off it because the committee was more interested in appearing useful than in being useful, and he did not have patience for the difference. He found 2 other families in similar situations and spoke to them quietly. He did not preach. He said, "There is a thing I have been doing and it is not complicated, and if you want to know more, here is what it looks like." One family got involved. The other sent a check and never followed up. He thanked both of them the same way. Caroline continued to organize bags. She became very good at it, specific, thoughtful bags, matched to actual needs rather than surplus. She recruited 2 of her friends, women named Helen and Ruth, who had children at Fairfield and who had not, until Caroline sat them down over tea one afternoon, ever thought to look at what happened 3 streets in a different direction. Helen organized a coat drive that first winter. Ruth started collecting school supplies. None of this was announced. None of it was on social media. It simply happened in the background of ordinary life, the way good things often do when they are done by people who are not doing them to be seen. Daniel watched all of this from the position of a child who was slowly becoming less of a child. He watched his father and his mother, and he absorbed the lesson not as a lesson, not as something taught with words and explanations, but as a way of being, a shape of living. You see something that is not right. You do not wait for someone else to fix it. You cross the street. He saw Elias 3 or 4 times a year. They met sometimes at a park near Clement Street, where Richard would take both boys on a Saturday morning and sit on a bench with a coffee and a newspaper and leave them to their own devices. They kicked a ball. They argued about books. Elias had opinions, strong ones, held quietly until he trusted you enough to share them. They walked around the park and talked about the things boys talk about, and sometimes said nothing for 20 minutes, which is its own kind of friendship. Elias was doing well at school. Not easily, nothing in his situation came easily, but consistently. He was the kind of student who did not flash brilliantly in class but who worked through things with a precision that his teachers found striking. He read everything. He remembered it all. He had a mind that was orderly and detailed and very, very patient. By the time he was 12, his teacher at Clement Road had written 2 letters, one to the school's authority, recommending him for additional support, one to a charitable trust that funded scholarships for secondary school. The scholarship trust responded 4 months later. Elias was called for an interview. He sat across from 3 adults in a room with high ceilings, and he answered their questions in his quiet, careful way, and he did not perform for them. He did not tell them a story about his struggles that was designed to make them feel something. He simply told them what he knew, what he could do, and what he intended. He got the scholarship. Richard heard about it from Patricia at their next meeting. He nodded. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "That's his, he did that." Patricia looked at him. He had help. Richard shook his head slightly. Everyone has help. The question is what you do with it. Patricia smiled. She had been in this work for 11 years. She had seen a lot of people offer help and then quietly arrange for credit. Richard Calloway was not that. She was glad he existed. Daniel was 12 when he found out about the scholarship. His father told him over dinner one evening, simply, the way he told him most things. Elias had earned a place at a good secondary school. He would start in September. Daniel put his fork down. He felt something expand in his chest, warm and bright and slightly too large for the space it was in. He pressed his hand flat against his sternum, the same unconscious gesture from years ago. "That's brilliant," he said. "Yes," said Richard, "it is." Caroline looked at both of them. She had seen this look pass between them many times now, this specific, shared, private thing, and she loved it, and she never interrupted it. The dinner continued. The evening came. Daniel went to his room and sat at his desk and opened the drawer and pulled out the folded page with the small star on it. He unfolded it, carefully, along the old creases. The paper was soft now, the ink slightly faded. He read the 3 sentences he had written at 8 years old. Community means seeing someone who needs something and not walking past. It means going toward them, not away. I think most people want to help. They just forget that they can. He read it twice, then he folded it back up and put it in the drawer. He sat at his desk for a while longer, not doing anything in particular. Outside, the oak tree moved in a small wind. The garden was dark. The street beyond the wall was quiet. He thought about a boy he had watched through a car window, on a hot afternoon, on a street corner outside a restaurant, eating from a metal bin with bare feet on hot pavement. He thought about how that boy was now, at 12 years old, on his way to a good school with a scholarship that had his name on it. Only his name, earned, his and new shoes and a shelf of books, and a quiet, ordered mind that the world was about to get a proper look at. He thought about what it had taken to make that happen. A car stopped at a curb, a man who went still, a decision made without announcement, a street crossed. He thought about the crouch. He would spend a long time thinking about the crouch. Because the crouch was everything. Not the money, not the meals, not the bags or the shoes or the scholarship letters. The crouch was what made all of it possible, the willingness to go down, to get to someone's level, to look at them from the same height and say, "I see you. You are not beneath me. You are not a problem to be managed. You are a person and I am a person and we are standing on the same ground. His father had known how to do that without being taught, because he had stood at the bottom of things himself once, and the memory of it had not hardened into bitterness. It had stayed soft. It had stayed available. Daniel was 12, sitting at his desk in the dark, and he thought, I want to be that. Not a specific profession, not a role, not a title, just that, the person who crosses the street. The person who crouches. The person who acts without waiting to be seen acting. He did not write it down. He just held it. And in holding it, he kept it. He is 31 now. That is the thing about these stories. You begin them at the moment of contact, at the bright, sharp point when something changes, and you think that is the ending. But the ending is never where the feeling is. The ending is years later in the ordinary afternoon, when you see the thing that was planted in you finally and fully become what it was always going to be. Daniel Calloway is 31 years old, and he is walking back from a lunch meeting in the center of the city. And it is a warm afternoon, and the pavement is crowded, and he is thinking about something else entirely when he turns the corner onto a side street and stops. There is a child going through a bin outside a coffee shop. She is small, maybe 7 or 8. Her hair is in 2 uneven braids. She is wearing a green anorak that is too big for her. Her shoes are on, but only barely. The left one has no lace, the tongue flopping loose as she moves. She is not panicking, she is methodical. Daniel goes still. Not a pause, still. He stands on the pavement and the world continues around him, people walking past, a bus rolling, a phone ringing somewhere, and none of it reaches him, because all of it is somewhere else and this is here, and here is a child, and he knows exactly what she is doing and exactly why. He does not think about what to do. He has not needed to think about it for a very long time. He crosses the street. He approaches her slowly from the side so she can see him coming and is not startled. He stops a few feet away. He crouches down. She turns and looks at him. Her eyes are dark and careful and give nothing away. She takes a small step back. "Hello," he says. "My name is Daniel." She says nothing. "I'm going to get something from that coffee shop," he says, nodding toward the door. "Would you like to come in? You can get whatever you want." She looks at the coffee shop. She looks at him. She is calculating. She is always calculating. He waits. She does not say yes immediately. She thinks about it. Then she looks at him with those careful, dark, unreadable eyes and gives one small nod. He stands back up. He holds the door open. She walks in ahead of him. He follows. A woman at a table near the window glances up from her laptop and sees them, the tall man in the good jacket and the small girl in the oversized green anorak, and something in the image makes her stop typing for a moment. She watches them go to the counter. She watches the girl point at something in the glass case. She watches the man nod to the person behind the counter, and she watches the certainty in the gesture, and she watches the girl receive what she pointed at, and she watches the way the girl holds it. Carefully, the way you hold something that might be taken away. The woman at the table does not know what she is watching, but she feels it. Something real is happening 3 feet away from her, and she feels it the way you feel a change in the weather before the sky shows it. She doesn't look away. Daniel doesn't see her. He is sitting across from the girl now who has told him her name is Nia, and he is listening, really listening, the way his father always listened, and he is thinking about what the next right thing is, and then he is going to do it. Not for recognition. Not for the story of it. Not even for Nia entirely, though he is doing it for Nia, absolutely first and last. He is doing it because one afternoon, when he was 8 years old, he pressed his face against a car window and watched a boy eat from a metal bin, and his father got out of the car and crossed the street and crouched and looked a child in the eye and said without words, "You are not invisible to me." And because of that, and because of everything that came after it, Daniel knows, in a way that lives in his body, not just his mind, that this is what people are capable of. This ordinary, world-changing thing. This crossing of a street. This crouching. This moment of going down to meet someone where they are and saying, "I see you. I am here. You can have what you need." He knows it because he watched a man do it, and the watching changed him, and the change took years and grew slowly and without drama, and now it is simply who he is. His father is 63 years old and still not interested in credit, still meeting twice a year with Patricia, who has expanded the shelter and added a reading program and a homework space and a room with 6 computers, none of which bear anyone's name, still making quiet phone calls, still crossing streets, different streets, whenever he finds himself stopped by what he sees. Richard Calloway walks through the world the way a man walks when he knows what the ground felt like before it was solid, and he has not forgotten, and he does not intend to. Elias is 25. He is a teacher. He teaches English and history at a secondary school in the north of the city, and he is the kind of teacher his students remember, not because he is dramatic or loud, but because he is precise and present, and he looks at each of them as though they are capable of more than they believe, which, in his experience, they always are. He has a shelf of books in his classroom. Many of them are ones he has had for years. Some of them are ones that were in a bag, left at the shelter on Clement Street when he was 8 years old. The spines are soft. The pages are marked up in pencil in his careful handwriting. He has never met the woman who packed that bag. He knows someone packed it. He has never needed to know more than that. He does not think often about the afternoon outside the restaurant on 5th and Grove, not because it was unimportant, but because it is so fully inside him that thinking about it would be like thinking about breathing. It is simply part of the structure of who he became. He knows that a man crouched down and spoke to him at eye level. He knows that nobody had ever done that before. He knows that the experience of being looked at without being looked down at, of being treated as someone worth the trouble, was so specific and so new that it had rearranged something in him that afternoon, something fundamental, and that the rearrangement had been quietly working on him ever since. He does not know Richard Calloway's name. He does not need to. He knows what the act looked like. He has carried the shape of it. And he does it every morning in a classroom that smells of whiteboard markers and morning light, when he looks at a child who is doing their best and he goes to them and crouches down beside their desk and says, quietly, "Let me show you how to do this. You can do this. I am here." The small girl who was looking through the bin on a side street, whose name is Nia, will be taken care of today. Daniel will make sure of it. He will not do it perfectly. No one does these things perfectly, but he will do it seriously and specifically in the way his father taught him without ever calling it teaching. And years from now, it is possible, it is entirely possible, that Nia will be walking down a street on an ordinary afternoon, and she will turn a corner and she will stop. And she will cross the street. And the whole long chain of it, that one afternoon outside Harlow's restaurant, that one man who went still and then went forward, that one child on a hot pavement with bare feet, will move through her without her knowing where it came from. She will just know what to do. Because that is how it works. Not in speeches, not in monuments, not in the names on buildings or the photographs taken for the record. In a man who crouches. In a boy who watches. In a door held open. In the simple, radical, deeply human act of going down to someone's level and refusing to look away. That is the whole of it. That is everything.